All right, so hello, welcome back to the archives. I want to share now Abutsu. Abutsu. So we're going back to Japan. One second, I just want to look up what her what it says here. Abutsu follows the way of poetry, and so she was born in the year 1232. No, she was born in 1222. And she lived from 1222 to 1283. So now we're even further. This is 200 years after Lady Murasaki, right? So now we're in the this would be what, the 13th century, 1200s. Wait, what? Yeah, the 1400s. Anyways, is it 13th century? So this is year 12. In year 1232. So that would have made her what, 10 years old? So at 10, she's not a teenager. This is a teen girl, was brought to the imperial court in Kyoto by her adopted guardian father. She was placed in the temple in the palace to help serve the princess. And this girl was Abutsu. Again, we don't know her given name because we don't have records of what a lot of girls' names from back in the days. Um, but she was later known as Abutsu. She was a huge fan of Lady Murasaki, a huge fan of Lady Murasaki, who had come 2 centuries before her, right? A century is 100 years. So that's 200 years before her. And she followed the way of poetry, which is that was what it was called. To follow in the line was called the way of poetry. And so Abutsu was known for her writings, for her memoirs, for her poetry, for her prayers. She wrote a prayer for her husband later, and also for her diary entries. So very similar to Lady Murasaki, right? Lady Murasaki was also known for her journal entries as well too. Japan has changed somewhat since Lady Murasaki, it says, right? But the women still wore silk kimonos. The silk kimonos were still in. I'm not sure if they still layered them or not, but they were still in. The long, silky, jet black hair was still in. The geishas were more popular now. Remember in Lady Murasaki's years, it was just the geishas were just coming up. Now the geishas were full force, just living their best lives. They were said to be floating, right? And so they lived in, most of them were in Kyoto. They were entertaining people. Abutsu was skilled in all of this. So she came up as a geisha, is what it sounds like. But she was also really educated. She was also really talented in poetry. And so she had that going for her, right? So in 1185, the emperor of Kyoto had just about lost its power, right? The shoguns were in. Shoguns were military leaders, and they were basically the de facto leaders at the time, okay? Power had shifted from Kyoto to Kamakura, which was a new city that was popping. It was known as a Kamakura period, which was between 1185 and 1333. And so the new center of power was moved to Kamakura. Confucianism was back in China, from China, right? So we see an emergence of Confucianism again. There's more hierarchy. Um, the traditional way where Japanese women lived within maternal homes, that changed. That all changed after basically now with Confucianism, they were to go live with their husbands once they were married. The husband would retain all of the control over her finances. If any love affairs produced children, they used to be raised in a maternal home. Now with Confucianism, uh, the mother, like I said, moved to the husband's home, gave all of her power, resources. So she lost economic power and political power at that time, right? And so, again, like I said, during this transition, we see a lot more folks converting to Buddhism, um, including the princess that Abutsu was working for. So remember, she was brought to the palace. While the princess she was working for, um, she had basically become taken a vow as a nun, a Buddhist nun, at 27 years old. So the princess, she lived a life of luxury in Kyoto, but she devoted her time to study and leisure. Um, Abutsu taught her calligraphy and poetry. Abutsu herself had memorized, remember the Tale of Genji, which is the first novel written by Lady Murasaki? Abutsu had memorized that entire novel and would recite it for the princess. Once, while she was working for the princess, Abutsu became pregnant. No one knows who the father was, but it was a little bit of a scandal. And so she left the palace and she retired to a nunnery in Hokeji, Hokeji, which is a Buddhist convent and a temple. At that time, she said her heart was broken. It sounds like she had a bad case of limerence or maybe unrequited love. It was during this phase where she wrote a book called Fruitful Slumbers. And so instead of that's how she felt her feelings, right? She's pregnant, she lost her job, she's in this convent. The man she wants don't want her because she had a baby. And so she starts writing, she turns into the art, she writes a first book. I don't know if it's her first book, but she writes a book. And so once the baby is born, she's while she's working at the convent. The baby's name is Ajari. Oh, what a beautiful name. I love that. Her son's name was Ajari. I love that so much. She gave him to the nuns who raised him to be a monk, and her son became a monk all his life, right? Well, while she was staying at the convent, she had another love affair. This man was of a higher rank, right? So she has another love affair. It doesn't sound like she had much choice, right? Dr. Joy says it kind of sounds like she was coerced into it. Either way, she gets pregnant again. The man leaves, right? So he disappears. She's kicked out of the convent. It's a scandal this time, and I think the scandal is because she had a daughter. It was a girl, so they didn't want it. They couldn't take. Remember, they took her first son. Her first son, they were raised to be a monk. The daughter comes along, they're like, "No, girl, you did this twice in a row. You didn't learn. Get out of here." So she gets kicked out. She gets shunned. She moves into a small house in the mountains. She lives a life of poverty for 3 years. She's trying to raise her daughter. Her daughter's name was Naishi, Ki Naishi, another beautiful name. So she's like lost all her support. She writes about like I can't believe how poor and destitute I am. I lost everything. I'm even too broke to buy blankets to shield us from these cold mountainous windy weather. But she stayed faithful to Buddhism. She found faith in Buddha, right? She remembered Buddha's teaching that this life, it always changes. So, and it did, it changed for her. So in 1252, she was commissioned to make a copy of the Tale of Genji for the daughter of Fujiwara no Tameie, who was a literary figure. So, wow, she breaks through. She's like, thank God he hired me to do this thing for his daughter. He is a man of wealth. He's very well known in the literature industry, in the writing industry. He's 54 years old. He's already married. He has a wife. He has a son. He has a daughter. He's living his life, right? Remember, his daughter is who he commissioned her to write the thing for. Well, Tutu, she marries him. She becomes his second wife, and he takes her and her daughter in. Okay, so when her daughter was 6 or 7, Fujiwara had her placed in court, so she became skilled at the music. At 14, Ki Naishi writes her mom to be like, I need help. This life in the temple, I'm like competing with all these concubines. I like, how do I move up the ladder? I need your advice. So text that her mom writes becomes one of her mom's most notorious, like famous books. So her mom writes her daughter back, and it's called The Nursemaid's Letter. And so basically, it's a classic text in Japanese literature, and it's Abutsu writing her daughter, giving her advice on how to navigate life in the court, right? And so she basically says you have to learn about the traditional ways, the traditional skills like painting and poetry and handwriting and calligraphy. She warns her daughter to hide her feelings. She says, be serene, don't show your cards, have a serene exterior, right? She tells her daughter, you need to be sexually attract. You need to be sexually attractive. You have to catch the emperor's eye. That's the only way you're gonna make it up the ladder is if the emperor, you get his attention. Remember, Wu Zetian did the same thing. She got the emperor's attention, and that's how she became empress. She basically was like flirting with him. Again, these are kids, right? So she tells her daughter also have a backup plan, right? If the court doesn't work, make sure you have a backup plan. Your backup plan should be in Buddhism, right? Study Buddhism, the ways of Buddha, and have a backup plan. So this is a letter she writes to her daughter. It's a classic text. Um, Follow the ways of the bodhisattvas. Her daughter does everything her mom says, and she's very successful, right? She catches the attention of the emperor. She has a kid with him. The kid becomes one of the heirs. Her daughter becomes really, really famous for her writing as well. I don't know if she's famous, but she basically just was like, she moved up. She was that girl. She moved up. She had a kid with the emperor. She got his attention. And she was living good. Okay. Now, Abutsu is still married at this time. She still lives with Fujiwara for over 20 years. They work together on poetry together. Then he dies. Her husband, Fujiwara, dies in 1275 and he leaves her a widow. She now becomes known as a monk, a nun. So she shaves her hair, she removes herself from society, and she becomes a nun. At this phase, she writes a letter for her. No, she writes a prayer. This is when she's known for writing a prayer for her husband. So she writes a prayer for her husband. It's a memorial called The Repose of His Spirit. In it, she praises his accomplishments. She dedicates her life of prayers to Buddha for him. She says how she misses him, right? And so basically, this prayer, the A Repose to His Spirit, becomes another one of her famous texts that she's known for. So you can see how, like, in some of the darkest, her hardest her hardest life moment, she turns to writing, poetry, literature, art to get her through. And the things that she writes during these low periods become what she's known for. And basically, because he had other wives, more children, by the time things got to her, they didn't have much. I know that's experience similar to, from my understanding, that's in my own lineage, that's what happened. Is on my paternal side, my grandfather was, he was a chief, had a lot of resources, but by the time things got to my dad's mom is the third wife, there wasn't much to pass on. And so my understanding is my elders, like my dad and his siblings, they grew up really, really wealthy, riches, the royal life, and then their dad died and they didn't get left anything. And so that's like their financial trauma, right? It was like we grew up with all of this wealth and now we don't have nothing when our dad dies. That's what happened to Abutsu and her sons. She was living this life of wealth. Her husband died. He had to pass off all his other stuff to all his other kids and all of his other wives. By the time it got to her, he left her very little. She was furious. She fought this. She was like, no, at least my sons deserve your writing text. We are the poets of this family. How are you going to give his poetry to his first? He basically left everything with his eldest son. She didn't like that. She's like, why would he leave all of this to his eldest son? His son is not even into poetry. Our sons, my two boys, are poets. They follow their father's lead. My sons deserve at least his works of art. So she went to court and she fought this in court, and she would spend the rest of her life fighting this in court. It dragged out and dragged out and dragged out. So the lawsuit, she lost. She went back and appealed it, right? Then she turned to the military tribunal to help appeal it. And so her appeal was what made her the most famous. Her appeal, this process is what made her the most famous. So in 1279, she and her son went to Kamakura. It was a 14-day journey, and during this 14 days, she wrote in a diary. And it's known as the Diary of the 16th Night Moon. It's her most famous piece of writing, right? She was really determined. It shows how strong-willed she was. She was a Buddhist warrior. It shows her values. And it was travel journals, right? So these were called travel journals, which were popular at the time, says Dr. Joyce. And so, ironically, it wasn't her two younger sons that joined her. It was her older son. Remember the monk? Um, from her first, nobody knows who the baby daddy is. He joined her on the trip to Kamakura, and its pilgrimage literature. It was so popular in the 13th century in Japan and in Europe. And in Japan, they were known as journals of the path. And so it shows her self transformation. People wanted that. People wanted to see how other people's lives were transformed and to learn from it, right? They wanted to know and see the human potential for change. And so it's been her longest survival. It's been one of the longest survival travel diaries. She wrote lyric poetry in there. The journal is said to have been divided into the first part was a prologue. The second part was about the journey itself, moving through the mountains, going from this Kyoto to Kamakura. The third part was about her stay in Kamakura, what that was like. And the fourth part was her hope for a successful lawsuit, right? She wanted to win the case. And so she combines politics, there's literature, she adds poetry in there. It's like one of her most popular works, right? She arrives in Kamakura in the autumn. She finds a place in the mountains. Much to her dismay, the military had to tend to other matters, right? The Mongols were invading, and so in on August 15th of 1281, Japan was saved by the winds, the typhoon winds. Typhoon winds came, the Mongols lost, and Japan was saved by the kamikaze. So kamikaze is the divine wind or spirit wind, right? So because the military had to go and help with the invasion of the Mongols, they didn't have time to tend to her. Well, she ended up dying. She died the year after, or 2 years after. But before she died, she was teaching about her writings. She was spreading the Tale of Genji. She loved that book, so she was still reciting it for people. And then Abutsu dies in 1283 before the lawsuit is decided. So she didn't even get to see the lawsuit through. 3 years later, the case was made against her son. So her sons didn't lose. 3 years later, her sons didn't give up. Her sons kept on fighting. They appealed it. They kept on fighting. They kept on fighting. And eventually, years later, they won. And her two sons were appointed the guardians of their parents' literary works. So that was Abutsu's journey. Basically, she went from working in the courts to um, being hired to work for the princess, and then later Fujiwara, who became her husband. She's known for her poetry, for her prayer book, as well as the pilgrimage travel journals that she wrote during her time. So, like Lady Murasaki, she really was influenced by Lady Murasaki. She really admired Lady Murasaki, and she was her version of Lady Murasaki in the 13th century. So, that's Abutsu, follows the way of poetry. So pretty much that's it for her. I think she's buried in Kyoto, but there's another place that claims her. I don't remember the other place that claims her, but yeah, so that's some Japanese history that I learned. Again, poetry was art at that time. Poetry was life also at that time, and you see that poetry has a really big uh, role to play in Japanese culture, right? Like the haiku poem literally comes from Japan. So I'm gonna end it there. Until next time, in solidarity.